I worked the front desk at a hotel in Perth, and last month, an American couple checked in for their holiday. They're both 68, still working remote jobs from their laptop by the pool. The wife asked me if Australia has something called retirement because she'd heard rumors. I said, yeah, most people here stop working around 60. And she looked at her husband like I'd just told her we have flying kangaroos. He said that's impossible unless they're all secretly millionaires. And I explained our superannuation system where employers automatically put 12% of wages into retirement accounts. She interrupted to say that in America they have 401ks too, so it's basically the same thing. I mentioned that super's mandatory for every employee. He said mandatory sounds like communism, then asked if we're allowed to choose our own investments. I said yes, we pick our super fund, and she jumped in to explain that Americans have way more freedom because their system is optional, which means people who can't afford to save don't have to feel bad. She seemed really proud of this until I mentioned our average worker retires with around $200,000 in super. She went quiet, then said, well, that's probably only like $80,000 in real money, and her husband nodded. Later, I saw them both on work calls at 7 p.m. by the pool. The husband came down the next morning and told me he'd been thinking about it all night. And he figured out why our system works here but wouldn't work in America. He said Australians probably just make way more money, so 12% is easy. I told him our median wage is pretty similar to America's once you convert currency. And he said that can't be right because Americans would definitely know if they were getting secretly robbed of 12% of their wages. His wife joined him and added that, at least in America, you get to see all your money first and then decide what to do with it, which is what freedom means. I mentioned the super money grows tax-free, and you can't touch it until retirement, which prevents people from accidentally spending their future. She said that's exactly the problem. What if you have an emergency? And I explained there are some hardship provisions. He cut in to say, Americans are smart enough to save on their own if they want to. They just choose to spend money on more important things right now, like Ram trucks and kitchen remodels. Then he asked when I'm planning to retire, and I said probably around 62. And his wife actually laughed and said, must be nice to live in a fantasy world. I'm a financial advisor in Melbourne. And last year, an American client in his 50s came in asking about retirement planning. I explained that his employer has been contributing to his super fund since he started working here 3 years ago. He could check his balance online. He said he doesn't trust automated systems and would rather just work longer to make up for lost time. I pulled up his super balance, showed him he already had about $83,000 growing. And he stared at the screen like I'd just shown him evidence of alien life. Then he said this must be some kind of shared pool that the government raids whenever they need infrastructure money. I explained it's his personal account, managed by professional investors, completely separate from government funds. He asked why Australia would just give people free money. I clarified that it's not free. It's 12% of his wages his employer puts in on top of his salary. He said on top. Real slow, like he was trying to catch me in a lie, then asked what the catch is. I said there's no catch. That's just how the system works. He told me that in America, employers match up to 3% if you contribute first, which he thinks is more fair because it rewards people who are responsible enough to save. I asked if he contributed to his 401k back in the States, and he said he couldn't afford to because rent was expensive. Then he said, at least in America, you're not forced into socialism. And I mentioned Australia's retirement system is actually one of the most capitalist ones because it's all privately invested. He looked confused for a long time, then asked if he could withdraw his super balance in cash right now because he didn't consent to participating. I said, no, you can't access it until you're at least 60. And he said, so it's a hostage situation, before he left. He told me he'll probably just move back to America at 65, because at least they're honest about workers having to fend for themselves. My cousin manages a payroll company in Brisbane, and she told me about an American, an employee who'd been working for an Australian client company for 6 months when he noticed a line item on his payslip labeled superannuation. Sent her an angry email asking why the company was taking money out of his check for something he never authorized, and she replied, explaining that it's not taken from his pay. It's an additional 12% the employer contributes. He wrote back saying, That makes no sense because companies don't just give away money for nothing. So she must be lying to cover up the deduction. She sent him educational links about Australia's super system, and he responded with a 3-paragraph email about how Americans learn in school that retirement is a personal responsibility, not something companies should be forced to fund. He said his dad worked until he was 78 and never asked for handouts, and that's called having character. My cousin replied that super is legally required and benefits him, and he said if it's so beneficial, why is it illegal to access your own money? Which proves it's a government control scheme. Then he demanded to opt out so his employer could pay him that 12% as cash instead. She explained that's not how it works. It's a separate contribution mandated by law. And he said Australia must be running a Ponzi scheme where young people's super pays for old people's retirement. She sent him the government website explaining that super is individually owned and invested, and he wrote back saying he'll believe it when he sees it, which won't be for another 20 years, so nice try. He still asks her every few months if the law's changed yet so he can opt out. I'm a taxation officer in Sydney, and last month, an American expat came in furious because her accountant told her she needs to list her superannuation balance on some forms. She said she doesn't have superannuation because she never signed up for it. And I pulled up her tax records showing 3 years of employer contributions. She went silent for a minute, then said, "So my employer's been stealing 12% of my salary this whole time?" I explained again that it's on top of her salary. She said that can't be true because companies don't work like that in the real world. I showed her the exact legislation requiring employers to pay super on top of wages. And she said, okay, but what's the real reason? Like I was hiding something. Then she asked who controls this mysterious money, and I said she does. She can choose her fund and investment options. She said if she controls it, she wants it paid into her bank account. And I explained it's locked until preservation age to ensure retirement savings. She asked what happens if she just never retires. And I said then, it keeps growing until you access it. And she said so, it's a trap to force people to retire. I clarified that people can work as long as they want, but the money's there when they need it. She said, in America, people who want to retire save money themselves. And people who don't want to retire keep their entire paycheck, which is called freedom of choice. I mentioned Americans often retire with insufficient savings. And she said that's because they're spending money on living their lives, instead of being forced to park it in government accounts. Before leaving, she asked if there's a form to transfer her super to an American bank. And when I said no, she muttered something about financial imprisonment. My brother works at an accounting firm in Adelaide. And he told me about an American client who called in a panic because his Australian employer told him he can't access his super fund for another 15 years. He said he needs that money now because his car needs new tires. And my brother explained that super is designed for retirement, not current expenses. The client said that's insane because in America, you can take loans against your 401k whenever you need to. And my brother said that's actually one of the reasons many Americans retire with nothing. The client said at least they have the option. He'd rather have freedom with consequences than be treated like a child who can't manage money. My brother mentioned that most Australians retire more comfortably than most Americans because the money's protected. And the client said comfortable is subjective, and he'd feel more comfortable knowing he could access his own money in an emergency. Then he asked what happens if there's a stock market crash and his super becomes worthless. My brother explained that super is diversified across many assets and has consistently grown over decades. The client said that sounds like something a scam artist would say to keep you from asking too many questions. And my brother asked if he understands how investment funds work. The client said he understands that in America, if he wants to blow his retirement savings on a boat, that's his constitutional right. And my brother said okay. But statistically, most Americans who can access their retirement early end up broke. The client replied broke but free, like he'd just delivered a mic drop line. My brother said the call ended with the client asking if there's any way to move to a state within Australia that doesn't have mandatory super. And my brother had to explain that's not how countries work. I work at a cafe in Hobart that's popular with tourists. And last spring, an American couple in their mid-60s sat down and started talking about how they're both planning to work another 10 years. The wife said retirement at 75 is the new normal in America because people are living longer. Her husband nodded and said their generation is just tougher than previous ones. I brought over their coffees, and the husband mentioned they'd been talking to an Australian couple at their hotel who retired at 61 and 58. He said those people must have had inheritance money or hit the lottery because normal working people can't retire that early. I mentioned that's actually pretty standard here with our super system, and the wife said, "Oh, we have that too. It's called a 401k. I said super's a bit different because it's mandatory and employers contribute 12% automatically. And the husband interrupted to say that Americans would never accept forced savings because it violates free market principles. His wife added that their 401k is better anyway because they got to choose their contribution percentage. And she chose 0 because they needed the money for their kids' college. She seemed proud of this decision until I mentioned that with super, you get the retirement savings without reducing your paycheck. The husband said that's mathematically impossible unless Australian employers are all secretly charities. And I explained it's just built into our employment law. He thought about this for a while, then said, "Well, American companies are more efficient, so they can't afford extra costs like that." His wife agreed and said that's why American businesses are the most successful in the world. Then she asked how much the average Australian has in retirement savings. And when I said around $200,000, she literally laughed and said Americans easily have that much too. They just keep it in different accounts. Her husband quickly changed the subject to how much they're enjoying. Tasmania, my wife manages a financial planning office in Cairns. And she told me about an American client who came in asking why his super balance seems high compared to what he saved in his 401k over 15 years in the States. She pulled up both accounts and showed him his American 401k had about $32,000 and his Australian super had $125,000 after just 8 years. He stared at the numbers for a solid minute, then said the Australian system must use funny accounting to inflate the balance. She explained it's straightforward, 12% contributions plus investment returns over time. And he said there's no way the math works out that much better in just 8 years. She walked him through the calculation, showing that consistent 12% contributions compound significantly, especially compared to his sporadic 3% contributions in America. He said he only contributed 3% because that's all his employer matched, and anything more would have been wasteful. She mentioned that in Australia, he gets the full 12% regardless of his own contributions. And he said, "So, you're telling me I've been getting 12% more money this whole time and didn't know it?" She said essentially yes, and he sat back and said, "This feels like a scam, but I can't figure out what the scam is." Then he asked what happens when the system collapses because there's too many retirees. And she explained that super is individually funded, not a government pension, so demographic shifts don't collapse the system. He said that can't be right because he's read articles about retirement crises in every developed country. She said America's retirement crisis is specifically about people not saving enough, which is why Australia made it mandatory. He looked at his super balance again and said, "Okay, but when I try to withdraw this, they're probably going to hit me with huge penalties, right?" She said no. After 60, it's tax-free. And he just stared at her like she'd told him the ocean is made of lemonade. I'm a bartender at a pub in Darwin. And last year I got talking to an American tourist in his early 70s who is still working remotely as a consultant. He said he'd love to retire, but can't afford to because he only has about $45,000 in savings. I mentioned that seems low for someone who's worked 50 years. And he explained that he had more, but had to withdraw from his 401k early a few times for emergencies. Plus, the 2008 crash wiped out a lot. Then he said, "At least in America, you have the freedom to access your money when you need it, unlike countries with forced savings." I said, "Our super system prevents exactly that problem by locking the money until retirement." And he said, "That's the problem. What if you have a real emergency?" I mentioned there are hardship withdrawals for specific situations. And he said specific situations decided by who? The government. Like he'd caught me in a gotcha moment. I said, "Yeah, there are rules." And he said that proves his point about freedom. Then he asked how Australians retire in their 60s if they can't access their money for emergencies along the way. And I explained that's exactly why they can retire, because the money's still there. He thought about this, then said Americans have a different mentality where they value living in the present over worrying about the future. I asked how that's working out for him at 72. He said he wouldn't trade his freedom for anything, then went back to answering work emails on his phone. Before he left, he mentioned he'll probably work until 80. Maybe 85 if his health holds up, and he said it with this weird mix of resignation and pride. Like working forever is some kind of achievement instead of a failure of the system. I run a retirement planning seminar series in Perth. And last month, an American couple attended who'd recently moved here for work. During the Q&A, the husband asked why Australians don't seem worried about retirement like Americans are. I explained that mandatory super means most people accumulate significant savings without thinking about it much. And he said without thinking about it is the problem. His wife agreed, saying Americans are more financially literate because they have to actively manage their retirement. I mentioned that Australia has higher average retirement savings despite lower financial literacy requirements. He said that's probably because Australians earn way more or live way cheaper. I showed statistics proving median incomes and costs of living are roughly comparable, and he said statistics can be manipulated. Then he asked what happens when someone makes bad investment choices with their super and loses everything. And I explained that super funds have professional managers and regulations to prevent that. He said, "So you're telling me Australians just trust strangers with their future and hope for the best?" I said it's not hoping. It's a regulated system with decades of proven returns. And his wife jumped in to say that Americans prefer to control their own destiny. I asked how many Americans successfully do that, and she said the ones who are disciplined and smart. I mentioned that even disciplined Americans often retire with insufficient savings because the system's voluntary and complex. And the husband said that's just Darwinism, people who plan ahead succeed. His wife nodded and added that in Australia, everyone gets dragged along regardless of whether they deserve it, which removes personal accountability. I said the result is Australians retire more comfortably on average. And they both went quiet for a second before he said, "Comfortable isn't everything. Some people value other things." I didn't ask what those other things were because I was pretty sure the answer was freedom to retire broke. My sister works at Sydney Airport Customs, and she told me about an American passenger who was filling out entry forms when he got confused by a question about his superannuation status. He asked her what that word means, and she explained it's the retirement savings system. He said he doesn't have anything like that and left it blank. And she mentioned that if he's working in Australia, his employer will set it up automatically. He said automatically. Like she'd just told him they install tracking chips, and asked if he can decline. She said no, it's mandatory. And he said mandatory retirement savings sounds like something from a dystopian novel. She explained it's one of Australia's most successful policies and helps ensure people don't retire in poverty. And he said if people retire in poverty in America, that's their own fault for not planning better. Then he asked what percentage of his paycheck would be taken. And she explained again that it's 12% on top of his wages, not deducted from them. He said, on top? Sure, with heavy skepticism, and asked where this magical extra money comes from. She said it's factored into employment costs. And he said that means he's getting paid 12% less than he would in America to pay for this. She said no, wages are competitive and the super is separate. And he said economics doesn't work that way. Someone's paying for it, and it's always the worker. Before walking away, he muttered that he's going to check his first payslip very carefully for theft. My sister said she sees at least 2 or 3 Americans a month with similar confusion about super. And they all seem personally offended that it exists. I said that's not really how it works since it's in private accounts. And she said, that's what they tell you now. Her husband added that they're actually glad America doesn't have mandatory super because it would probably be mismanaged anyway. Like most government programs. I didn't mention that super isn't a government program because they were already walking toward the exit. The wife turned back and said, good luck with your retirement at 62. Hope it works out, and I couldn't tell if she was being genuine or sarcastic. I saw them getting into an Uber. They're flying back to keep working into their 70s. fully convinced they've got the better system.